Hi there, my name is Jason DeYoung and thanks so much for tuning into my YouTube channel. I'm an avid deer hunter and I'm also lucky to have a family of 4 who love to eat venison. So each year I look forwards to the many deer hunting opportunities offered by the province where I live. For the past several years, I've tried to combine my freezer-filling pursuits with a video project showcasing a different aspect of my favorite deer hunting tool, the 12-gauge shotgun. And you've tuned into my 2017 episode where I'll try to bring you along on a couple of my deer chasing adventures. Early in my hunting life, I primarily used a rifle for my deer hunting pursuits, but as the seasons have come and gone, the rifles become less and less attractive for me as a meat-getting tool. For as I've gotten older, I find more and more I crave the awesome interaction between me and the many deer that's created by the range limitations of the shotgun, and consequently, the necessity to get close for a quick, clean kill. In trying to get close with my shotgun, I'm afforded many opportunities to watch deer, often at pretty close range. And while I work to try to get within close range, it's quite often that the deer won't cooperate, and I'll spend many evenings watching them bounce back into the bush. This is compounded by the difficulty of dragging my video camera with me everywhere I hunt. But interactions like the one you've been watching in this intro make it more than worthwhile and not only create connections between me and my food that I just don't get when I go to the grocery store, but also many cherished memories of my time in the woods and lots of fuel for imagining how all those deer I watch running away get to spend the rest of the year. So with that preamble out of the way, I'll now introduce you to one of the special aspects of this year's deer hunting episode, low recoil double-aught buckshot. Remington employs 2 strategies to reduce the recoil of these managed recoil double-aught buckloads. The first is to decrease by 1 pellet the conventional double-aught payload from 9 to 8, and the second is to reduce the payload's velocity from the traditional 1400 feet per second to 1200 feet per second. Housed in a conventional plastic wad, the 8.33 caliber pellets are buffered to help prevent deformation upon firing, and combined, the shot payload weighs about 410 grains, or 15/16ths of an ounce. The reason I'm interested in reduced recoil buckshot is the second unique aspect of this year's hunting video project, a kit-built Mossberg 590A1 Shockwave clone that I put together with a Raptor grip made by Shockwave Technologies, and a 14-inch OEM barrel kit made by Mossberg. The kit came with a heavy-walled barrel, a shorter magazine tube, shorter action bars, and a synthetic forend that's equipped with a strap to help keep you from losing elements of your support hand. The barrel's set up with Mossberg's standard threaded bead, and it turns out this is the Achilles heel of the whole setup. The non-raised bead is too low to be used effectively with a barrel this short. At 10 yards, my gun was shooting about 2 feet high, and at 20 yards, it shot a horrid 5 feet high. Fortunately, a simple commercial solution was readily available in the form of a glue-on aftermarket tritium illuminated night sight made by Excess Sight Systems. The Excess sight had a much higher profile, and after gluing it in place with some JB Weld I got from the hardware store, I was thrilled to discover it now shot point of aim with a wide variety of different shot shells. Now confident that I could effectively aim the gun, I set out to understand the patterning characteristics of Remington's managed recoil buckshot through my Shockwave clone. My target was a 12-inch cardboard disc, which I shot in 7-yard increments from 7 out to 28 yards. From a distance of 7 yards, all 8 pellets made a nice tight group about 6 inches wide. At 14 yards, it was a pleasantly effective group about 10 inches wide, and surprisingly not much different at 21 yards. But at 28 yards, the limitations of the gun and load became apparent, so I decided my maximum effective range would be no more than 25 yards. I ran a couple rounds over the chronograph and was surprised that the short barrel came with almost no penalty in velocity. And I also fired a couple of rounds into tubs of water to gain an idea of how much shot deformation was happening upon firing. Here's what 8 unfired pellets look like, and here's what I recovered from my water testing. You can see that there's some mild deformation, but nothing like the deformation I've seen from higher velocity unplated lead. So with all that out of the way, let's go hunting. I was pretty excited when winter blew in at the start of our November hunting season, as I'd practiced hard with my Shockwave clone on clays, cardboard, and steel. I was confident I could ethically hunt deer with it, provided I kept my limitations in the front of my mind and did not give in to the temptation of shots which fell outside of my constraints. With this in mind, I set myself to studying some local deer to try and figure out where they were bedding, where they were eating, and how they traveled between the two. It didn't take long to generate some ideas, so I loaded up my gun and started to try them out. My first play was to set myself up at the bottom of a weed-surrounded rock pile, just on the edge of a poorly combined grain field. It turns out this was an awesome spot, and as I settled in for the last hour of the afternoon, I enjoyed quite the show. It's always a bit hard for me when I have to steel myself up to finish a deer like that, but all in all, it was a pretty rich afternoon, and I was pretty happy with the outcome. Especially when I saw all this fat. My lovely bride and I have a great method for making cold processed soap from deer fat, and I was thinking that we may have just landed on the subject for next year's deer hunting adventure. As the skinning process brought me down to her thorax, I recovered 2 pellets just under the backside of her hide. They were reasonably round, and nothing like the 3rd recovered pellet I pulled from inside her front side leg. It had been completely flattened into a pancake while breaking a ginormous chunk of bone out of the end of her humerus. I was surprised that the low recoil buckshot would have enough energy to flatten a pellet like this, and later in the video I'll make sure I include a segment where you can see it in a bit more detail. As I continued skinning, I discovered 3 more entry wounds, and I recovered the pellets that made them when boning out her neck and far side shoulder. I was surprised at the degree of bloodshot meat in the far side shoulder, and pleased that 6 out of the 8 pellets had found their mark. So with my first shockwave deer now in the freezer, I headed back out to see if I could find some antlerless mule deer. It was now a couple weeks later, and a big chinook had blown through and melted most of the snow. What was left was super crunchy, and it made moving around really difficult without making a lot of noise. So with my binoculars in hand, I parked myself up top a series of wooded draws and was lucky enough to watch this mule deer buck come out of the woods to feed on the flats below. The wind was totally wrong, so even though he was a couple hundred yards away, He knew something wasn't right and kept looking up in my direction. I figured his does would not be far away, so I beat a hasty retreat and made a plan to creep into the top of the wooded draw for first light. I set myself up with plenty of time to spare, and as fortune would have it, I was lucky enough not to bump any deer on my way in. The morning unfolded, and it turns out I was in for quite the spectacle. The eyeball test revealed that some of the pellets from my 2 shots had found their mark, and I was really happy she'd only traveled 3 or 4 yards after jumping the fence. I spent the next hour getting in a pretty good workout as I drug her back up the hill. I'd felt pretty confident when I shot her, so there weren't many surprises when I opened her up for field dressing. Both my transverse and longitudinal shots created multiple pellet penetrations of her thorax, and there was lots of bleeding from her heart and lungs. A quick examination of her heart revealed at least 3 pellet penetrations, and there were another 3 of the pellets from the longitudinal shot that made it through her diaphragm and into her liver and stomach. After pulling out her guts, I was a bit pressed for time, so I didn't bother looking for any of the pellets in her viscera, but later when skinning and deboning her meat, I recovered 6 from her backside skin and skeletal muscles. Particularly interesting was this wound track through her backstrap along the side of her spine. As I soaked it in a brown sugar soy sauce marinade, I marveled that she was able to continue to move with a pellet passing this close to her spine. We wrapped the backstrap with bacon, cooked it for 30 minutes at 375, then finished it on the barbecue to get the bacon crispy. It was so delicious, my family devoured it as if it was their last meal. Inspired by a couple of great meals, I set out to punch my last remaining antlerless tag. It came in the form of a rushed opportunity, for as I was chatting up a local rancher to get some intel about some mule deer I'd seen nearby, he gestured over towards his stackyard where a muley had just jumped on top of his bales. He told me to go get those deer out of there, so with little light remaining, I rushed to get downwind and make some sort of approach. After circling around, I fumbled to set up my camera and the deer made me, but not enough to panic off. Sure something was wrong, a doe and her fawns moved to get me upwind. They'd been right at the edge of my effective range, but it was evident that some of the pellets had hit the fawn I'd chosen to shoot. So as they bounced out of sight into the hayfield, I quickly moved up to the edge of the field where I could see a bit better. The fawn ran about 100 yards, then fell just inside the field at the edge of a wooded escarpment where the rest of the deer had gone. Not wanting her to make the woods, I waited and watched as long as light would allow. It was sad to watch Mum and her remaining fawn come back out of the woods to try and coax the downed fawn into getting up, but as the day's light ran and I got up to make my final slow approach, I was happy when it was just 2 deer that ran back into the woods. The eyeball test confirmed the fawn was dead, and with that, my 2017 hunting season was over. I sat with the fawn for a few minutes to watch the sky darken over the mountains and felt grateful for a season rich in experience and fortune. As I dressed her out in the dark, I noticed a lot of blood in her thoracic cavity, and while there were no pellet penetrations of her heart, there were several through her lungs. After I got her home and set to skinning and butchering, I recovered 3 pellets from her torso just under her far side skin and 1 from the muscles in her neck. In total, I recovered 16 pellets from the 3 deer I took with my Shockwave this year, and in general, the pellets held up pretty well. Despite being swaged from some reasonably soft lead, they only exhibit slight deformation from firing, which I think helps with their patterning. Some have large flattened surfaces, likely the result of contact with bone, and that one super pancake pellet is the one that broke the humerus of this year's whitetail. I chose low recoil buckshot for use with my Mossberg Shockwave because of how difficult I found it to try and hang on to the Shockwave with standard power ammunition. And initially, I was a bit worried about the low recoil buckshot's ability to kill cleanly. But this season's experience demonstrated that within the limitations of pattern, the combination of the short-barreled pistol-gripped gun and the low-recoil buckshot made for a pretty effective deer killer. I feel like I'm pretty lucky to have these types of opportunities to interact with the food I feed my family, and I'm also deeply thankful I've found a way to share these adventures with you, my YouTube audience. I really appreciate your interest and support, and hope you'll tune in next year. Cheers, and thanks for watching.